Separated as we are by the safety and comfortable distance of almost 200 years from the events of the Texas Revolution, it's easy to fall into the complacent viewing of them as part of the grand and romantic narrative of Texas history that started being shaped when it first became a possibility that there might be such a history as the sun set on April 21st, 1836. We have been conditioned to rely on words like glory, glorious, bravery, heroism, villainy, tyranny, destiny, and more such descriptive words when we remember it each year. And that's all well and good. But it's also good to remember that these were real people facing real challenges with a variety of motivations and opinions, both personal and collective. They were not just characters in a story playing a role. They were alive and had dreams and aspirations. They each had a future until many of them did not. And many futures were terminated in 1835 and 1836 with the impact of a musket ball or the collision of a bayonet with a body. It's been said, and I believe it's fairly true, that we are a nation shaped by war. And the Texas Revolution was but one part of our long warlike history. But its battles and its resulting aftermath loom large in the overall narrative. There is not a doubt that the dead had wanted to be longer involved in that narrative's construction, but that is the nature of life and the nature of war. As one writer said, so it goes. War is hell. So goes the oft-repeated statement attributed to General William Tecumseh Sherman. He was 16 years old when the events of April 21st, 1836 unfolded on a strip of land where the San Jacinto River and Buffalo Bayou meet. His entrance into the life of war would come after his graduation from West Point in 1840 and his service in the Second Seminole War and the United States Civil War. And if I may be permitted to digress at the beginning, in Cormac McCarthy's brutal classic Blood Meridian, the character Judge Holden expounds on his thoughts on war and its centrality to human existence. And I wanted to share some excerpts that I've edited down from a passage in the book. And let's begin with this. It makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be. That way and not some other way. And a few lines later, the judge adds, all other trades are contained in that of war. And then another character asks, is that why war endures? And Judge Holden replies, no. It endures because young men love it and old men love it in them. Those that fought, those that did not. And the other man responds, that's your notion. And then McCarthy writes, the judge smiled. Men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows, too, that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Games of chance require a wager to have meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents, and the humiliation of defeat and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stake because they inhere in the worth of the principles and define them. But trial of chance or trial of worth, all games aspire to the condition of war. For here, that which is wagered swallows up game, player all. Suppose two men at cards with nothing to wager save their lives. Who has not heard such a tale? A turn of the card. The whole universe for such a player has labored clanking to this moment, which will tell if he is to die at that man's hand or that man at his. What more certain validation of a man's worth could there be? This enhancement of the game to its ultimate state admits no argument concerning the notion of fate. The selection of one man over another is preference absolute and irrevocable, and it is a dull man indeed who could reckon so profound a decision without agency or significance either one. In such games as have for their stake the annihilation of the defeated, the decisions are quite clear. This man holding this particular arrangement of cards in his hand is thereby removed from existence. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game and the authority and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will and the will of another within that larger will, which, because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. War is the ultimate game because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. And that's the end of the judge's statements there that I wanted to share. Now, Ernest Hemingway, who did his fair share of witnessing war, said, "Never think that war, no matter how necessary nor how justified, is not a crime. Ask the infantry and ask the dead." And he also said, "No catalog of horrors ever kept men from war." William Faulkner adds, "Because no battle is ever won," he said, "they are not even fought. The field only reveals to man his own folly and despair, and victory is an illusion of philosophers and fools." The Son of Man, as Jesus is sometimes called in the Gospels, also made comments on war. "And when ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, be ye not troubled, for such things must needs be, but the end shall not be yet." And he also said, "All they that take the sword shall perish with the sword." How to think about these quotes is open to debate. But one thing that is not up for debate is that in 1836, the Texian revolutionaries and the volunteers that had flooded their army were in the game of their lives with the army of General Santa Anna. And at stake, to again quote William Barrett Travis, was victory or death. Or as Shakespeare wrote in Henry VI, Part 3, "Sound trumpets, let our bloody colors wave, and either victory or else a grave." But that is not completely accurate. In the end, when all the moves in the game were made, the game of war would end with both victory and death. Mucha muerte. It's well known that Sam Houston had a lifelong love for Homer's Iliad, so it might do well to borrow from the ancient poet's works. There would be killing till the score was paid. Death and the strong force of fate were waiting. Slaughter and blood and the agonized groans of mangled men had been the price paid to the god of war in the battles and slaughters of the Texas War, and these offerings would again be submitted when the armies of Sam Houston and Santa Anna finally met in battle, and each general made their moves in the game. When Santa Anna had departed from Bear on March 31st, he left behind Sanchez Navarro. And Sanchez Navarro, he had wanted to participate in the ongoing campaign as a member of Cosa's staff, but was left behind. And he wrote, "It was denied me because he," meaning Santa Anna, "says that the campaign is already finished. I cannot persuade myself that this is true." And Sanchez Navarro also wrote, "I believe that His Excellency has no idea of the great rivers, deep arroyos, lakes, and dense forests through which he will have to travel. I pray for God to look with favor upon His Excellency and all those who accompany him. However, I very much fear the realization of the old adage, he who triumphs by luck alone without making plans for battle loses everything when he meets defeat." Had Santa Anna been open to advice from such men, the campaign in Texas might have turned out quite differently. The Texian army, moving east, and Mexican forces searching for them did so slowly. Suffering was their new normal. Hunger and cold and the mud were their companions. They were both contending with the same miserable conditions facing the thousands of Texans running away to the east. It was a cold and wet spring, and the frequent rains had pushed the rivers and creeks out of banks. Santa Anna moved onward, leaving Filasola behind with some troops for the arduous task of moving the artillery and supplies across the river. Santa Anna and Sesma reached San Felipe on April 7th to find it as Mosley Baker had left it, burned. Baker had also destroyed the ferry, leaving rafts the only options for crossing. And rafts were not an option because using them would make the Mexican soldiers easy targets for Baker's men to shoot from the opposite bank of the river. Santa Anna started for Fort Bend on the Brazos, near modern-day Richmond, Texas, and sent orders to Filasola, Urea, and Gaona to join him there. Once they were reunited, Santa Anna would have 3,400 men at his command to deal with Houston and his smaller band of soldiers. But this is not what happened. While at Fort Bend, Santa Anna learned that the ad interim government of Texas was only 30 miles away at Harrisburg on the right bank of Buffalo Bayou. Harrisburg was located just southeast of present-day downtown Houston. How could Santa Anna resist such an opportunity? First, he thought he would capture and punish the so-called government of Texas, and then move to crush the cowardly Houston and the fleeing Texans. That Santa Anna had little respect for the fleeing colonists and Houston's army is apparent in his 1837 manifesto, in which he wrote, "In spite of these impostures, there remained with Houston out of 1,500 men only the 800 with which he surprised my camp at San Jacinto. It could not be otherwise, a very considerable number having perished at Bayard, the Alamo, Goliad, and the plain of Perdido. In short, this was shown by the proclamations of the so-called government of Texas, in all of which appeals were made in desperate terms for the sympathy of the Americans to come to the rescue of their defeated hosts. Since the colonists, either voluntarily or forced by circumstances, persisted in taking refuge beyond the scene of war, Santa Anna felt completely justified in all of his actions. Since the Texians were relying mostly on an army filled with men from the United States. News from Fort Bend of Santa Anna's plans reached Houston on April 12th, and he took advantage of the presence of the steamboat Yellowstone and used it to move his command across the Brazos. Across the Brazos, and with the Twin Sisters cannons in tow, Houston and the Army of Texas moved on. But were they going to fight or just keep moving? That was a question that people in the government and soldiers themselves kept asking. But Houston kept counsel only with himself. Santa Anna decided to press on with a smaller contingent of soldiers. In orders for Urea, he said, "I leave today for Harrisburg with 500 men and 1 of artillery. I will arrive there day after tomorrow and hope to find the principal leaders of the revolution at that place, employing my ability to effortlessly defeat the so-called General Sam Houston, who is supposed to be on the march to that place with about 600 or 800 men. He is the only hope left for the traitors." And the number of soldiers traveling with Santa Anna is often listed at 700 to 750. The cause for this discrepancy between 500 and 750 might be explained by looking at a statement by George Erath, an Austrian who fought with Texas. With an actual force of hardly 600 men, he wrote, Santa Anna left his army. In all, he had perhaps 1,000 with him, but the rest were only cargadores or muleteers with some 400 or 500 pack mules to be loaded. An officer that was with Santa Anna, Colonel Pedro Delgado, wrote, "On the 14th of April, 1836, His Excellency, the President, ordered his staff to prepare to march with only 1 skiff, and leaving his own and the officer's baggage with General Ramirez y Sesma who was instructed to remain at the crossing of the Brazos, whither we expected to return in 3 days. On the 13th, the flank companies of the battalions of Matamoros, Aldama, Guerrero, Toluca, Mexico, and I believe Guadalajara had commenced crossing the river with a 6-pounder commanded by Lieutenant Ignacio Arenal and 50 mounted men of Tampico and Guanajuato, who formed His Excellency's escort. The whole force amounted to 600 men, more or less. About 4:00 p.m., His Excellency started for Harrisburg with the force above mentioned. The bottom of the Brazos is dense and lofty timber over 3 leagues wide. On reaching the prairie, we found a small creek which offered only one crossing. The infantry passed it comfortably over a large tree which had fallen in such a manner as to form a convenient bridge. The ammunition was passed over by hand, but His Excellency, to avoid delay, ordered the baggage and the commissary stores to remain packed on the mules. However, the water was soon over the pack saddles, and the opposite bank was steep and slippery. Several mules fell down, interfering with each other, which resulted in a terrible jamming of officers and dragoons, horses and mules. This, together with shouts and curses, completed a scene of wild confusion, which His Excellency witnessed with hearty laughter. Several officers and dragoons fell into the water, the stores were damaged, and 2 mules were drowned. So much for the precipitation of this march. The sun had already set when we resumed the march over a muddy prairie. The night was dark, a great many men straggled off, and our piece of artillery bogged at every turn of the wheel. Such was our condition when at about 9 o'clock His Excellency ordered a halt in a small grove, where we passed the night without water. Despite these troubles, Santa Anna reached Harrisburg on April 15th. He was disappointed to learn that he had just missed catching the Texas government. Burnett and the others had moved on towards Galveston Bay. Santa Anna had the town burned, and the only residence left standing was that of John W. Moore, who was a signer of the Texas Declaration of Independence. That little bit of trivia must have escaped Santa Anna's knowledge, or Moore and his house were just pretty lucky. The government of Texas just kept ahead of Santa Anna by traveling to New Washington at Morgan's Point on the coast. This is near the modern site of La Porte. Colonel Delgado provides a first-hand account of these events. He wrote, "On the 15th at 8 a.m., most of the stragglers joined. We started again. At about noon, we reached a plantation abundantly supplied with corn, sheep, and hogs. It had a good garden and fine cotton gin. We halted to refresh men and beasts. At 3:00 p.m., after having set fire to the dwelling and gin house, we resumed our march. Here His Excellency started ahead with his staff and escort, leaving General Castrillon in command of the infantry. We traveled at a brisk trot for at least 10 leagues without halting, until we reached the vicinity of Harrisburg about 11 o'clock at night. His Excellency, with an adjutant and 15 dragoons, went afoot to that town, distant about 1 mile, entered it, and succeeded in capturing 2 Americans who stated that Zavala and other members of the so-called government of Texas had left the morning before for Galveston. A part of the infantry joined us on the following morning at daylight. On the 16th, we remained at Harrisburg to await the arrival of our broken-down stragglers, who kept dropping in until 2 or 3 p.m. On the opposite side of the bayou, we found 2 or 3 houses well supplied with wearing apparel, mainly for women's use, fine furniture, an excellent piano, jars of preserves, chocolate, fruit, etc., all of which was appropriated for the use of His Excellency and his attendants. I and others obtained only what they could not use. After the houses had been sacked and burned down, a party of Americans fired upon our men from the woods. It is wonderful that some of us, camped as we were along the bank of the bayou, were not killed. The quartermaster sergeant of Matamoros was seriously wounded. This incident took place at 5:00 p.m. On the same day, Colonel Almonte started from Harrisburg for New Washington with the cavalry. And this Colonel Almonte, traveling with 50 dragoons ahead of Santa Anna towards New Washington, sent a report to Santa Anna that colonists had told him that Houston was headed for the Trinity River, and it would have to cross the San Jacinto at Lynchburg. Santa Anna sent an order to Filasola to send Coast with 500 choice soldiers to the San Jacinto instead of going to Velasco where they were originally intended. On April 16th, while Santa Anna was in Harrisburg, Houston and the Army reached Spring Creek in present-day Harris County. The next day, they would reach a spot where the road diverged and presented two options. One option led towards Louisiana, the other led towards Harrisburg and the Mexican Army. The men wondered what was going on in the mind of their commander. Many of them threatened to rebel if Houston pointed them towards Louisiana. Of course, this distrustful and fractious bunch included Mr. Mosley Baker. Even though angered by the constant attacks on his authority, Houston might have appreciated the honesty of his subordinate yet vocal opponents. As it reads in the Iliad, Achilles says, "Hateful to me as the gates of Hades is that man who hides one thing in his heart and speaks another." Houston didn't have to worry about that with most of his men. They were pretty honest with him. On April 17th, the Texian Army took the fork towards Harrisburg. Also on April 17th, Santa Anna decided to go in pursuit of the fleeing Texas government. The route led them by the property of the Vince brothers, Allen, William, Robert, and Richard, members of Stephen F. Austin's Old 300, whose name became attached to the bayou and the bridge that crossed it. As they traveled by, they confiscated Allen Vince's Black Stallion for Santa Anna. Delgado wrote, on the 17th at about 3 p.m., His Excellency, after instructing me to burn the town, started for New Washington with the troops. It was nearly dark when we finished crossing the bayou. Then a courier from Colonel Almonte arrived, upon which His Excellency ordered Colonel Iberri to start with his adjutant bearing dispatches to General Filasola on the Brazos. At 7 o'clock p.m., we resumed our march. Our piece of artillery bogged at every moment in some hole or ravine. As it was found impossible for the draft mules to cross a narrow bridge, rendered still more dangerous by darkness and rain, His Excellency instructed General Castrillon to head the bayou with the cannon 3 leagues above, with an escort of only 1 company of infantry. Shortly after 10 o'clock at night, a violent storm set in. Darkness caused us to wander from our course, in consequence of which His Excellency caused a halt, requiring every man to stand in the ranks without shelter from the rain. On the morning of the 18th, we moved on, our cannon still being far away. At noon, we reached New Washington, where we found flour, soap, tobacco, and other articles, which were issued to the men. His Excellency instructed me to mount one of his horses, and with a small party of dragoons, to gather beeves for the use of the troops. In a short time, I drove in over 100 head of cattle, so abundant are they in that country. General Castrillon came in at 5 o'clock p.m. with the cannon. Now, Manuel Fernandez Castrillon, who is the General Castrillon in care of the cannon, was of Spanish descent, and he was, at this time, in his mid-50s, and he had fought alongside Santa Anna since 1821. And he's also the same Castrillon who had argued for the mercy for men at the Alamo and Goliad, but he was overruled. On the 18th, Houston and the Texas rebels arrived near White Oak Bayou, a tributary of Buffalo Bayou, and camped near the burned ruins of Harrisburg. And that same day, Deaf Smith arrived at camp, and he brought with him a captured Mexican courier who had dispatches that revealed more about Santa Anna's plans and the movements of the Mexican army. Houston knew that the main part of the Mexican army was being strengthened at Fort Bend. While he believed that there were about 1,000 soldiers there at the time, in fact, it was much worse. Filasola was gathering a force of 4,000. Houston also thought that Gaona was west of the Brazos River. Santa Anna had crossed over the bridge at Vince's Bayou and traveled down the west side of the bayou and the San Jacinto River. He would be returning to the area of Lynch's Ferry. They would need the ferry or the bridge to cross back over. Houston analyzed the dispatches and said to Thomas Rusk, "We need not talk. You think we ought to fight, and I think so too. So based on information that each leader had received, Santa Anna and Houston made decisions to head towards that same area. Now, at this time, Rusk and Houston again both issued appeals to the people of Texas. Secretary of War Rusk, who had joined the Army, began his appeal by writing, "Fellow citizens, let me make one more appeal to you to rally to the standard of your country." And then a little bit more into it, he added, "A few more hours will decide the fate of our army. And what an astonishing fact it is that at the very moment when the fate of your wives and children, your homes, your country, and all that is dear to a free man are suspended upon the issue of one battle, not 1/4 of the people of Texas are with the army." And in that, when he said people, he's meaning not 1/4 of the available men that could fight in Texas were not with the Texas Army. And Houston added his own statement, which included the line, "We view ourselves on the eve of battle. We are nerved for the contest and must conquer or perish." Houston also penciled a letter, which he gave to Rusk, and he had a copy given to Hockley, who was on his staff, and he had another copy sent to Henry Ragged up in Nacogdoches. And he did this to help ensure that the record of his thoughts were preserved in case things went wrong. He wrote, "This morning we are in preparation to meet Santa Anna. It is the only chance of saving Texas. From time to time I have looked for reinforcements in vain. The convention's adjournment to Harrisburg struck panic throughout the country. Texas could have started at 4,000 men. We will only be about 700 to march, besides the camp guard, but we will go to conquest." And he added that the troops were in fine spirits and that this was the time for action. Even if they would be outnumbered, which Houston expected, he was leaving the, quote, "result in the hands of an all-wise God." And so on the morning of April 19th, Houston announced to the Texian soldiers that it looked like they would soon get the action that they had been waiting for so long. And to fuel their fire, he stressed that they must remember the Alamo and Goliad. Still, rumors spread among the soldiers that Houston had no intention of fighting. The main instigators of these rumors included, of course, Mosley Baker again. Baker and others would be irritants to Houston for the rest of his life. Late on April 19th, Houston moved his army to the south or west, depending on how you read the map, side of Buffalo Bayou on rafts, about 2.5 miles below Harrisburg. He left behind a small detachment to guard the sick men and the baggage in the woods. The number left behind, mostly sick or ineffective, was about 248. When he had asked for volunteers to serve as the guard for the sick and the baggage, not a man volunteered. All wanted to be a part of the upcoming battle. Houston had wanted to leave the valiant Tejanos that were serving with 29-year-old Juan Seguin to serve as guards for the sick and the supplies. But Seguin would have nothing of it. You got to remember, Seguin had been at the Alamo and was only alive because he had been entrusted to carry a message from that doomed place. Had he not been sent as a courier, bearing yet another message crying for reinforcements, he more than likely would have shared the fate of the 7 Tejanos that had originally followed him into the mission. But no, Seguin and the Tejanos wanted to fight. Sergeant Antonio Menchaca told Houston, "I did not enlist to guard horses and would not do such duty." They wanted to exact their share of vengeance for the fallen. Houston acquiesced to Seguin's argument, and they were assigned as members of the newly arrived Colonel Sidney Sherman's regiment of Kentucky Riflemen, with one stipulation. Houston was very aware of the Anglo-Americans' ill will towards the Mexican people, and for the Tejano soldiers' safety, they were asked to place pieces of cardboard in the bands of their hats to signify them as allies. And with that settled, Seguin and the Tejano rebels departed Harrisburg with the rest of the Texian army. Just before sundown on April 19th, Houston addressed the men to ready their spirits for the fight. And he closed by saying, "This is our battle cry. Remember the Alamo. Remember Goliad." The men repeated the words. Houston cried it out again, and again the men roared. Houston later wrote, "This watchword was caught up by every man in the army, and one simultaneous shout broke up into the sky, and the green islands of the trees and the prairie sent back the echo."
You are listening to Texas History Lessons, a slow walk through Texas history made in Texas by a Texan for everyone, everywhere.
Now, this seems to be a good spot to pause and end this part of the episode on Battle of San Jacinto. I'm releasing it broken up into sections for those that like shorter episodes. If you want to just continue on, the entire episode and all of its length, all of its content is also available if you like longer, uninterrupted versions of this episode. You can go find it, or just wait and you'll get the next episode soon to continue on towards the clash of armies at San Jacinto. Thanks to everybody for listening. Thanks to Derek McClendon for providing the theme music. We'll see you next time as we continue on this story. Thanks for listening. Take care of yourself. Take care of one another. Be kind. Adios.